Good morning, everybody. My name is Dina Maiben. I am professor of Hebrew here at Gratz College, and I run the Hebrew and Yiddish programs. And I'm the theme of our conference is the future. Yesterday's keynote speaker talked a lot about the future in higher education and some of the major challenges that we are all facing in higher ed and as a global community. Today, I'm going to be focusing on much less lofty and earth-shaking kinds of futurism and talk specifically about the future of language. And to help me along with this, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this particular topic is the future of Hebrew and the future of the Hebrew language. It is a little bit dangerous to try to predict the future. The great English philosopher and politician and economist Edmund Burke said, "You can never plan the future by the past, but we can make a few tentative predictions based on universal trends, as well as what we see currently happening within the language." So that said, is that language changes. It is constantly changing. It changes in terms of vocabulary. It changes in terms of the grammatical structure of words, changes in grammar itself, like word order and grammatical characteristics. And it changes, but slowly, in pronunciation. Give you a sense of just how much it changes, I'm going to take you back and tell you one of the great stories in linguistics. It is probably apocryphal because we have no actual documentation that this actually took place. We have had several versions of who was involved, but there is some documentary evidence from that period that tells us that at least parts of this are accurate. So the story goes like this. In 1666, London was ablaze. The city was on fire, everything burned, including St. Paul's Cathedral. And the British government, the royal family, because St. Paul's is, of course, the royal seat, they hired the most famous architect in England at the time, Sir Christopher Wren, and asked him to restore the cathedral. Now, the version of the story that I heard is that Sir Christopher, at the completion of all of this, took Queen Anne on a tour of the cathedral. There are different monarchs that are named in the various versions of this story, but I heard it first as Queen Anne, and so I'll go with that one. He took Queen Anne on a tour of the cathedral, and afterwards she declared that the cathedral was awful, artificial, and amusing. And according to the story, Sir Christopher was delighted by the royal compliment. And that is because words have changed over time. Awful in the 1600s meant awesome or awe-inspiring. Artificial, meant that it was artistic or a great artifice. And amusing meant that it came from the muses. It was inspired. So Sir Christopher was delighted by that compliment. Obviously now we can't use those words the same way. I will tell you that the words awful and artificial were both found in documentary records from various correspondence and contracts regarding the construction of St. Paul's, the reconstruction. So those two words we know were actually in use in this way at that time. So rule number one in linguistics, as we saw earlier, is that language changes. Rule number 2 is that there are some predictable forces that shape the way languages change. One, a major driver, especially today, is new technology. I am using words in my day-to-day existence that 10 years ago were not in my vocabulary at all. And that is because technology has exploded. We also know that cultural exchanges will cause language to expand. It will shape the language. Some of those cultural exchanges are very benign, like foreign trade, international trade, which has produced any number of word borrowings in different languages. We also know that flip side of that is that wars and invasions can also change the nature of the language. That is actually the story of English in a nutshell, is that you had a group of Gaelic speakers who were then invaded by Saxons, by Romans, by Danes and Vikings, and each group shaped the language in different ways. It's interesting, hold on. Each group shaped the language in different ways to make English what it is today. And of course, everyday use over time also tends to change the language. Pronunciation is actually the slowest part of language to change. And one of the most interesting things that I know about Hebrew is that while there are lots of different dialects and pronunciations of Hebrew that have fed into what we currently have, that new immigrants tend to retain the Hebrew pronunciation that they know from their home countries. So, for example, when I was in college, I had a Hebrew professor who was born in Iraq, and he would give us these dictation tests. And I could always tell when he was using an aleph, when he pronounced an aleph, or when he pronounced an ayin, because he said ayin way in the back of the throat. He retained the pronunciation of the Iraqi Jewish community, at least to some degree. And we know that that is true with immigrant communities as they come in. In terms of regional dialects in Hebrew, Israel's a very small country, and it's a country that came into existence pretty much in step with radio and then television and telephones, and those kinds of things tend to flatten the pronunciation. So the only dialect I know of in Israel that is radically different or was radically different from the rest of the country was pronunciation in Jerusalem. And in particular, it has to do with the aleph in the middle of a word. So here we have a 200 shekel note. This is ma'atayim or matayim shkalim chadashim. In Jerusalem, instead of saying matayim shkalim chadashim, they would say ma'atayim. And that is still something that I hear from a certain generation of speakers who grew up in Jerusalem. They've retained that kind of pronunciation. It's the only dialect I know of that's really different by region at this point. Vocabulary, by contrast, is the most permeable. It's constantly changing. New words are added. For second language learners, this is great news because it means that one's ability to acquire new vocabulary, that opportunity, that window of opportunity never closes. Grammar changes more slowly, and that tends to be under pressure of rapid speech by people who don't want to spend a lot of time enunciating. And pronunciation is slower than grammar. So language change is inevitable and it's actually healthy. So for example, I am of a certain age and I am made crazy by certain changes that are happening in English. The word fewer is going away from the English language. It's this all started with an advertisement on television, unfortunately, but it has now spread to professors. I hear professors interviewed who actually say this. They say there are less people involved now than there were. This is crazy. It's not less, it's fewer. This change makes me completely crazy as a native speaker of the language. On the flip side, as a linguist, I rejoice because the only languages that don't change are dead languages. And the fact that English is changing constantly, making me crazy, is a sign that English is really healthy. And I would say that that is also very true of Hebrew. Hebrew never was a dead language because new vocabulary was added into it at every point in history, but it was a deeply hibernated language because nobody was speaking it as a native speaker. So, vocabulary, the easiest way of expanding language and the one that's most permeable. There are three ways that languages acquire new words. One way is through expanding their existing root words. This is a favorite in Hebrew. There are now more versions of different tri-letter roots than there used to be. Compounding is not Hebrew's favorite way of doing things. It's German's favorite way of doing things. In German, you can smash a whole bunch of nouns together to get a more complex noun. We can do the same in English, but we don't do it anywhere near to the extent that Germans do it. And of course, English's favorite way is through borrowing. We now know that 60% of all the words currently used in Hebrew have their roots in the Bible, have their roots in ancient Hebrew, which means 40% are not purely of Hebraic origin. They could be from rabbinic origin, which is still Hebraic, but they're not part of the organic growth of the language that really came to a screeching halt in around the year 200 CE. And Hebrew has borrowed terms also from Semitic sources, such as Arabic and Aramaic, from diaspora languages like Ladino and Yiddish, and especially from the international vocabulary from English and French and German, especially from English, and also through a process known as loan translation or calques, which we'll get to in 1 second. This brings us to Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern conversational Hebrew. Ben Yehuda grew up in a very, very traditional Jewish home. Unfortunately, his father died when he was only 5, and so he was sent to live with an uncle who sent him to a yeshiva. This was all in a neighboring town. And the head of the yeshiva was a secret maskil. The Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment in Eastern Europe was very much a countercultural phenomenon. And one had to engage in it pretty much secretly if you were part of the traditional community. Because Ben Yehuda was a brilliant student, the head of the yeshiva introduced him to Haskalah and to secular literature and to Hebrew and the Bible especially. In 1878, Ben Yehuda entered the Sorbonne to study medicine. Now you have to understand what a good linguist that is. Here is someone who speaks a whole bunch of languages other than French, who is going to go study medicine in French. Gotta love it. While he was in Paris, he met a journalist, an international journalist named George Selikovich. Selikovich told him that throughout Asia and North Africa, there were Jewish communities that used Hebrew as a lingua franca, as a way of communicating with each other when they didn't share a common language. Subsequently, Eliezer contracted tuberculosis, And while he was in the hospital, he met A.M. Lunz. Lunz was there getting treatment for his eyes because he was going blind. And Lunz actually spoke Hebrew with Ben Yehuda and told him that in Jerusalem, all of the different Jewish communities use Hebrew, primarily rabbinic Hebrew, to communicate when they need to talk to each other. And he told Ben Yehuda also that they spoke using a Sephardic rather than an Ashkenazic pronunciation. This all prompts Ben Yehuda to make the decision to go to Israel. He and his wife undertook a major project to make Hebrew the modern spoken language of the Jewish community in what was then Palestine. It was under Ottoman rule at the time. So he basically had a three-part plan: Hebrew at home, Hebrew at school, and words, words, words. Hebrew at home meant that he wanted a home where Hebrew was the only language spoken. It wasn't completely possible because they did have guests who didn't speak Hebrew, but they made their home as Hebrew-centric as possible. They raised the first Hebrew-speaking child, first native Hebrew speaker in 2,000 years. His name was Itamar. Actually, his name was originally Ben Zion Ben Yehuda, but he changed his name to Itamar Ben Avi, saying that there could only be one Ben Yehuda. That is how much the child really had great respect for what his father and mother were doing. He also felt that just as he had seen in Russia how Russian had become a universal language throughout the Russian Empire, and the way that had happened was that they instituted Russian language classes in the public schools and got all the kids speaking Russian. Ben Yehuda decided that that was the only way to make this work with Hebrew as well. And he had great support from the teachers union, and he himself joined the union and actually taught Hebrew in one of the schools for a while until his health got in the way. But it solved a major problem. They had people coming in from all sorts of Jewish communities speaking all sorts of different languages, and getting everybody to speak Hebrew was a solution to which language are we going to use, because it was the universal Jewish language. And the largest undertaking that he did was the creation of words, 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 words. He created a dictionary. He himself published, I think, 5 volumes of it. There are 17 in total, completed by his wife and his son. And he had to find a way to coin new words to deal with all of the advances since biblical times. And he published those in his own newspaper. He also realized that he couldn't do this all by himself, and so he formed a committee in 1890 known as the Va'ad Halashon Ha'ivrit, the Hebrew Language Committee. It was originally Ben Yehuda and 4 other members: David Yellen, who we're going to come to again in a moment, Rabbi Chaim Hirschhorn, A.M. Lunz, whom we had met in Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yaakov Meir, who went on to become the first chief Sephardic rabbi. I mentioned Yellen in particular, David Yellen, who eventually became professor of Hebrew language and literature at Hebrew University. He was also the founder of the Teachers Union. He was pivotal in the success of this program. And you see him seated in the front, in the center. He is the guy wearing the fez because he was a great supporter of the Ottoman Empire. And this little quote comes from the basic charter of the language committee that they drew up. And their goal was to coin new words that would, especially from Semitic roots, from Aramaic and Arabic. And this photograph was the committee as it stood in 1912. And Ben Yehuda is in the white suit, seated on the right on the front row. Now, it's important to note that from 1890 until really the founding of the state, this committee had lots of problems. They had very little formal support. Only the teachers union supported them. They had no government support. They had no funding. And there were competing groups coming in saying, why should these guys be the ones to decide which way Hebrew was going, and so on. It was not without its difficulties, and it didn't really get going in a consistent and ongoing way until after the First World War. At the same time, they had a set of principles for how they were going to prepare Hebrew to be a spoken language. And one of these rules was what vocabulary could and could not be introduced. So they wanted to prioritize Hebrew from all literary sources from all the periods in history. Could take vocabulary from anything that was done in Hebrew in writing. They wanted Hebrew roots that they could use to manipulate and form new words and develop new words from them. They were incredibly successful in that. They used Aramaic, provided it was given Hebrew forms. And so one of my favorite pieces of this is the words Abba and Ima. Abba is actually Aramaic. It means dad, it means father, the father. And Ima means the mother. But they took those Aramaic words and turned them into the endearing terms for mom and dad. I love that particular piece. They wanted to use Semitic roots, especially Arabic. And non-Semitic words were only allowed in if they were already being used in the language or if they had a Hebrew form and were in common use. So Ben Yehuda in particular had a thing for Arabic. He fell in love with Arabic and in fact declared that he had found a whole bunch of sources for new Hebrew words and they were all in the Arabic language. Mishmesh is a great example. The word for apricot in Hebrew is drawn directly from Arabic. This is great. Sufganiya or Sufganit. This particular expression or word was coined by David Yellen based on the rabbinic Hebrew term sufganim. Sufganim are some kind of spongy pastry. Yellen actually coined only the plural for this. He decided sufganiyot was the right word to describe donuts. The question was what was going to be the singular for it. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the father of modern Hebrew poetry, absolutely detested the yud-hey suffix. He tried to get rid of it as often as he could. So originally the committee decided that sufganit would be the singular, and that it would be sufganit and sufganiot. Now, the custom of eating these things goes back to beyond the 12th century. The father of Moses Maimonides, no less, actually wrote about eating sufganim or sofganim during Hanukkah, fried dough pastries. And so in the late 1920s, the Histadrut, which was the labor union for the country, realized that they were not getting enough work for bakers, that at Hanukkah time, people were making potato pancakes at home, and it was taking away from the bakery business. So they wanted to increase business in the bakeries. So they introduced sufganiyot as a special Hanukkah delicacy. And it in fact worked. And they not only got people coming in to buy them, but actually were able to increase the labor force in the bakeries. Fascinating stuff. Another way that the language committee, the Hebrew language committee, created words is through loan translations. A loan translation, or calque, is where you have a word that exists in a foreign language and you translate each part of that word into its Hebrew root. So, for example, we have in German the word Zeitung, which means newspaper. Comes from the word Zeit, meaning time, and which is like tells you it's a noun, a time thing. And so Ben Yehuda took the word et, meaning time, and added the suffix on, meaning a thing, and came up with iton. Same process was used for coming up with a name for potato. In French, potato is pomme de terre, apple of the earth. And so Hebrew did the same thing. Tapuach adama, apple of the earth. Now we come to the golden apple, the tapuach zahav, or in French, pomme d'or, or in Italian, pomo d'oro. So would the real golden apple please stand up? And we get from tapuach zahav, we get the word tapuz. It actually started, you'll see tapuach zahav, it started as an abbreviation so that when they were filling crates, they would mark them. And rather than having to write out the entire two-word phrase, they put tapu, then a chupchik, the little abbreviation mark, and then a zayin to tell you that it was not just a tapuach, but a tapuach zahav. And from that, we get tapuz, which eventually just became the word. Other produce products, Ben Yehuda had a real love affair with Arabic. He wanted the word banana to be muz, which is the Arabic word. That's what the Hebrew language committee approved, but it's since been replaced by banana. And that's an example of how languages tend to change based on usage. I have to say, language is an incredibly democratic thing. It relies on the will of the speakers of the language. So we come now to the tomato, or agvania. This is a great story. This is why this is a PG-13 conversation. So Ben Yehuda wanted, of course, to use the Arabic term for tomatoes. He wanted to call them bandoro, which was the bandora, which was the Arabic term drawn from pomo de oro, or pomme d'or, which comes in from the French. But pomme d'or is only one name that the French use for tomato. They also call it pomme d'amour. The reason for that is that when tomatoes first came to Europe, they were thought to be aphrodisiacs. And so pomme d'amour was the connected to this idea that it's a love potion. So the Hebrew Language Committee selected agvania for tomato. The term comes from a root that is related to the word for lust. And the word agevet, right, is in a form which is used to describe diseases. So we have ademet from adom for measles. We have sukaret from sukar for diabetes, and kalevet from kelev, which is rabies. Agevet means venereal disease. So I think of agvania as having a very colorful history. The other thing that the Hebrew Language Committee relied on a lot was the influence of the Bible. And this is a quote from the opening of the book of Ezekiel. where he talks about his vision. He sees this incredible wild vision. And if you look at the second word in the last line that I've quoted here, you see ha-chashmal. Chashmal is some kind of glowing fire, amber, molten something. It's a word that we don't really understand exactly what the Hebrew meaning was, but it was translated into Greek. When the Bible was translated into Greek, the word chashmal became electron or electrum, which is an alloy of silver and gold, and possibly bespeaks the notion of a molten fire that's enough to melt the two metals and put them together. Now, the word chashmal is, it's sort of a hapax legomenon. A hapax legomenon is a term that occurs only one time in a text or in a literature, in a body of work. It's a one-time word. And there are between 289, that's the absolute hapax legomena, and 1,300 hapax legomena in the Bible. Now, the 1,300 number comes from Yehoshua Blau, who was head of the Hebrew Language Academy. And Blau counted words that might have occurred more than a single time, but that occurred only in one context. And so chashmal, which occurs only in the book of Ezekiel, is sort of a hapax legomenon. According to Blau, it would be. The poet Yehuda Lieb Gordon suggested using chashmal as the term for electricity, based on electron being the Greek translation. So you have to understand, everybody that was involved in this process on the committee, these were real scholars. They knew their Bible backwards and forwards. They usually spoke multiple languages, and they were really very flexible in their thinking and very creative. As I had said, the Hebrew Language Committee had its problems, for sure. But in 1953, the Knesset approved the creation of Ha'akademia Lelashon Ha'ivrit, the Hebrew Language Academy. And it describes itself as being the successor of the Hebrew Language Committee. Here, for the first time, the body was granted absolute jurisdiction over the language that ended all those prior disputes. And one of its most ambitious projects has been the creation of a historical dictionary of the Hebrew language. It's been worked on for 5 decades by dozens and dozens of scholars, and they have completed a complete digital database of ancient and modern Hebrew. It's really quite impressive. At the same time, they are busy trying to coin terms for new technology, and asked, what are we going to call this thing that we all now rely on so much? The Hebrew Language Academy's answer was telephone nayad. Nayad means mobile. So a mobile telephone. But that's not really the whole story. The whole story actually has its roots also in biblical Hebrew, in this very famous passage from the Song of the Sea, the Mi Chamocha that we say in synagogue every day. And the last word on the line is Pele. Pele means wonder. The Hebrew Language Academy, well, actually before them, the Va'ad, approved the term Sir Pele, meaning wonder pot. Now, this was a really revolutionary thing in Israel. It was really important, because so many homes in Israel don't have ovens. They had, especially at the time, gas stoves or propane stoves. and you can't bake in a propane stove. So some people would go to a local bakery and, pay to have their bread baked there in the bakery's oven. But the Wonder Pot or Sir Pelle allows one to bake on a stovetop. And what it is inside, it looks like a giant angel food cake pan with a center column that sends the heat straight up through the center, and then it circulates around what's in there, and it allows one to bake. So Sir Pelle gave us Wonder Pot, Pelle gave us Wonder Pot, and an Israeli phone company, cell phone company, came up with one of my favorite new word coinages. Officially, it's the name of the company, but it became the generic Hebrew term for cell phones, Pelephone. It's a portmanteau of Pele and telephone. And the Hebrew Language Academy insists that we continue calling it telephone nayad, but the people in the street actually still call it pelephone. Another of my favorite new vocabulary offerings from the Academy is this one from the Academy, as opposed to one that came from the street. This again is an example of scholarship relying on the Bible. So this is from the end of the book of Jonah. And I've put in one of the traditional translations. It says that Jonah, Vaya'as, see if I can find it. Vaya'as, he goes out of the city and settles east of the city. Vaya'as lo sham sukkah, vayeshev tachteha betzel, ad asher yar'eh ma yeh ba'ir. Vayiman Adonai Elohim kikayon. Kikayon is the key word here. Kikayon, which is very often translated as gourd, is not a gourd. It's probably actually the castor bean or ricinus plant, which is a very quick growing plant. All you have to do is add water to it and it starts to spring up immediately. So the kikayon here again is sort of a hapax legomenon. Blau would certainly count it as such, but it occurs multiple times within this chapter. So the word kikayon has morphed to kikyoni. This is my favorite thing that the academia has done so far. Kikyoni means ephemeral. Here today, gone tomorrow, just as the plant that grew up overnight and vanished overnight in the book of Jonah. It's a fabulous coinage. It hasn't quite caught on completely, but I'm seeing it in dictionaries now. Kikyoni. So vocabulary changes fast, pronunciation changes at less than a snail's pace, and grammar is somewhere in between. And there are two ways that grammar changes. First, there are bottom-up changes, and there are top-down changes. Typically, bottom-up change is the only real way that language changes. Language is incredibly democratic. It relies on the will of the people. And so change happens from the bottom up. Top-down language changes are not as effective. People can ignore them completely. The French tried to do this to get rid of English from the French language, and it failed miserably. The Hebrew Language Academy is kind of aware that this is a potential issue, and of late have started crowdsourcing new vocabulary suggestions. I love that. That the Academy is doing its scholarship, but it's also checking in with the actual people who will be using it. Another change that's already happening is gender parity in grammar. The Academy has approved, this is interesting. So in Hebrew, the masculine traditionally is the default gender. So if you have a group of people and you have 105 women and 1 man, you use the masculine plural. The Hebrew Language Academy has approved using the majority of the population to determine the plural. So that's interesting. That's a huge, huge, huge change that has come from the Academy. And I think we're starting to see it also happen in real life. And another area where I see a lot of change already happening has to do with Hebrew numbers. So Hebrew numbers are gendered. This is issue number 1. Hebrew adjectives are really complex. The whole system for using adjectives in Hebrew is much more complex than it is in English. And when you add numbers to the mix, it gets even more complicated, because if you have 1 book, it's Sefer Echad, but if you have 2 books, it's Shnei Sfarim. And if you have 3 books, instead of Shnayim, it's Shnei. It's crazy. This is a crazy system, very complicated, very hard to learn, and it's an area that you have to pay special attention to with beginners. Now, what's happening is that some Israelis are now using only feminine numbers in rapid speech. So instead of saying Shnei Sfarim, they're saying Shtei Sfarim. Kama shkalim? Kama ze ole? Chamesh shkalim. No, it's chamisha shkalim. Well, but there is this tendency that since we count in feminine numbers seem to be taking over for both cardinal and ordinal functions. Another issue that's come up, just as it has in America, is how do you deal with non-binary folks? One way that this has been done is a young woman from Tel Aviv, she's a graphic artist. She designed a new few letters for the alphabet to make them gender neutral in terms of the system. So if you look at the Hebrew here, which is written in her modified alphabet, it's kol. I can't really read it because there's no pronunciation guide, but instead of kol ha'anashim shvaim, she has created a system where the aleph without 1 leg is not making a sound, or is making only part of a sound, and the vav in the plural ending, masculine ending, and the o, the vav in the feminine, and the yud in the plural have kind of become one thing with a gap between them. And there's a combination of the mem, final mem, and taf. She created this system. It was adopted by a lot of different entities. A school used it. It actually made it to the Knesset. There was a welcome sign at the Knesset. And it has not been without controversy because there's been a huge backlash against it. There's a lot of fighting going on about it. And it still makes no differentiation in pronunciation. And that's something that different groups, both in Israel and the diaspora, are working on, and nobody has a solution to, and the academia is absolutely silent on the subject. There is also some blurring of meanings with questions words. We're already seeing this. The word lama and madua, they used to have very specific, distinctive meanings, and that's not true now. There in Shir HaMa'alot, right, the Psalm 121, Esa enai el harim me'ayin yavo ezri. Me'ayin means from where. We used to, when I was first learning Hebrew, we were told you had to say me'ayin ata or me'ayin at, because you couldn't say me'efo. Efo was used only to indicate a specific location. But now, I'm even seeing it in print. It's common to ask me'efo ata, me'efo at. Big change. So vocabulary is permeable, new words are added, old words are discarded. Yeah, this is a biggie. We no longer refer to a bathroom in Hebrew as a beit kavod. We don't even really refer to it as a beit shimush, which was the term in use when I was first learning Hebrew, and now it's sherutim. Vocabulary is the last window of opportunity to close. It never closes. It's the reason that it's easy to acquire second language vocabulary, less easy to acquire the grammar, and variations in vocabulary may be based on regions. That's true of every language. I do not see that being true in Hebrew right now. It was true in ancient Hebrew. We can document that there were slightly different terms for things depending on which part of the country the speaker was from or the writer was from, but that's really not true now. So my prediction tentative for the future is new words will come into the language through immigration and technology and globalization. Grammatical changes are already underway. That's going to continue. Dialects will continue to hold for a generation as immigration continues, but eventually, all of the speakers speak a kind of standardized Israeli Hebrew. And all the changes will continue to make Hebrew teachers completely crazy. But I end this little slide presentation with the words of Abraham Lincoln, that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So, where are we? Any questions or comments?
Well, I put a small one in the chat.
Go ahead.
About banana.
Banana.
Banana has 3 hamatzim. I guess I just wasn't used to seeing Hebrew words with 3 hamatzim in them. Can you comment on that?
Ed, I'm gonna, oh boy, somebody, Moshe, I think it's
Yes.
your.
Yes, I
Go
sent
ahead.
you questions. First, I have to say it's very interesting questions. It's very interesting lecture that you gave. I'm very it's really amazing. And so I'm very pleased, with the lecture. I had so many questions as you spoke. Each time I wanted to ask, I just wrote only 2. But first I want to ask you, if I have any question, I can send you in the email on what you said.
Absolutely, yeah, I'll open that to everybody. If you have specific questions, you can send me an email.
Yeah. Okay, so one is that I wrote that I think so we all know Eliezer ben Yehuda, but I heard that David Yalin was the main guy. So it was not Ben Yehuda, he just took all the fame. So I wanted to know what was the truth. Also, for some of the questions that you mentioned, like Mataim and Mataim, what is the emet? What is the real thing? And because it has to be something that we call the MS. What is it? It's like you can't just change. And
okay. So let me take the first couple of questions. First of all, David Yalin, he was a major force in this. Yeah. Yalin actually loved using hapax legamina from the Bible and Aramaic and Rabbinic Hebrew as the basis. He didn't like using Arabic, which Ben Yehuda was so hung up on. But Yalin was also head of the teachers union and running 5 other organizations. So he didn't have the time to devote to creating a dictionary. Ben Yehuda was working on that dictionary sometimes 18 hours a day. And so he gets the credit because he created the dictionary. But Yalin was a major driving force in this. And I would say between him and Rabbi Meir, that is part of why Sephardic pronunciation became the standard, because they were both Sephardim and were promoting Sephardic pronunciation. Your second question had to do with matayim and ma'atayim, and which is correct. So I'm going to refer you back to the book of Judges, if you will, to the story of Yaphet and or Yephthah, who is the judge, and there's a civil war that breaks out between two tribes. And
Right.
And when they capture the fords of the Jordan River, to keep the other tribe out, he makes them pronounce a certain word. If the guy can pronounce, the guy is dressed up like one of us, but he's not really one of us. How do you tell? Well, you make him pronounce a certain word, and that word is shiboleth or shibolet, an ear of corn.
Yeah.
But the enemy can't pronounce the shin. Now, this is dating back to biblical times when Hebrew was the spoken language of all the tribes, and yet there were variances in pronunciation. If you look at the United States, there are humongous variances in pronunciation. Which one is correct? The one where you're living.
Wow. But I have to say, some you can see it's a mistake, like Ayin and Aleph. Aleph, you know, I tell you what I feel. I know how to pronounce the words, but if you want to pronounce it the right way, it takes time. I have no patience, like Ayin, Ta, and Ta.
Listen,
I think this is why the Israelis.
If you want to pronounce it the closest to the original way, you have to do it in Yemenite pronunciation.
Yeah, right. I have no patience. I have a problem when I pray, because when I pray, I have to say the right way. But I have just one more question. I think like it's clear, like the Ashkenazi way. I want to ask on this, the Ashkenazi, like they say, Oilam, this. I think this is, it's like they changed the original name, and this is my question. I assume that in the Bible, in the time of Moses, it's not how they spoke, right? It's came after. So really, correct. It's not the MS. It's not, it's like, it's
well,
like.
That's a problem with all languages before the advent of teletronics. We don't have a recording of what it sounded like. We don't really have a recording of what Beowulf speakers, you know, the speakers of Old English, we don't know what they said either. We can only piece it together from the written record. And, you know, we know that there's a pre-written language as well. We'll never be able to access that.
Wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah. Back to the banana question for a moment that Ed raised with, I found it in the chat. It's the 3 kamatzim in a row. Kamatz, kamatz, kamatz. Yeah. Nana. Banana. Now you would say bao now, right? In Ashkenazi, but this is Sephardic pronunciation.
Yeah, well, that's okay, but the pronunciation is okay. I was just trying to indicate what the old sound was, just so you'd understand what I was talking about.
Yeah.
But just the idea of having 3 of the same vowels in a row is kind of anathema, but that's just in my mind.
Yeah, you're correct. It's weird. It's a weird thing to have 3 in a row. And, you know, it's even sometimes a little strange to have 2 in a row, but 3 in a row is unheard of. But I think they did this. I don't know why they did. I guess it's because it's open syllables. I guess that's the only explanation I could come up with. I have no clue.
Actually analogous to here in downtown Philadelphia, we got 3 one-way streets in a row going the same way, and nobody's been able to explain it.
Yeah, or to fix it. Good. Okay. Moshe, did you have one other question?
No, I think if I need, I'm going to email you. I have to go over my notes. I'm going to email you. It's going to be easier. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions or comments? So, yeah, Janine.
When we were talking, you were talking about the change in numbers. So I teach little ones. And traditionally I have taught them the difference between the masculine and the feminine. should I continue that trend or should I move with the times?
So that's a great question. This is a great question for all Hebrew teachers. I teach beginning Hebrew also, but not to little ones. I teach it to older ones. And what I say to my beginning students is, I'm going to teach you the way that it's been done for thousands of years, because that is the tradition of the language, but I'm not going to ding you if you don't follow the direction. So if you say chamesh shkalim, okay, fine. You know, I'm not gonna jump all over that and correct it, because if the language is in fact changing that way, they're just ahead of the curve. But the reason that I teach the traditional masculine and feminine numbers is because they're going to encounter this if they ever read anything. And especially if they read Bible or Siddur, they're going to encounter this all over the place. And I want to make sure that they understand and have the basis to understand that this is part of the language. So that's my justification for the traditional way, but I'm also very much open to those changes. And frankly, I catch myself doing it all the time, using only the feminine numbers.
I think if you still get the meaning, I think that makes a justification for that's okay. You understand that they said 5 apples, or whether it was wrong or right.
Right.
I want to add just about the numbers. I used to teach Hebrew language also in my college. One thing that I learned, I never got to teach the numbers. It's so hard. It's a different thing. Like 2,558, how you pronounce it, this is hard. So I leave it on the side. But I remember just one more question, and I want to ask your opinion. I know that Havad LaLashon HaIvrit decided that the word kufsa and dugma should be written with hey, and you have to say dugmot and kufsot. And I see this in all the text. However, just me, for my knowledge and everything, I prefer to go with dugma and dugmaot, kufsa and kufsot. And it's not only because I feel it's Aramaic. I think they wanted to change it to show it's not Aramaic. But to me, it doesn't look like. So what is your opinion on that?
My opinion on that is that you go with the spelling that is in use. I understand wanting to be a purist, and frankly, if you misspell it, people that know that it's Aramaic will applaud you, and people that don't know that it's Aramaic will think you made a spelling error. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I do it. Thank you.
So we have hit 12 o'clock, which means I need to end the meeting. I'm going to end it by playing a song. I have actually pasted the link to YouTube for this thing in the chat, so I urge you all to copy it. This is called Ha'ivrit HaChadasha, and it will show you exactly how the language has, oops, looks like I've lost it. Okay, then I'll just do it from the chat. It shows you exactly how Hebrew has adopted so much English into the language that didn't used to be there. It used to, and in fact, the Hebrew Language Committee has had all manner of difficulty trying to get people to not use this, not use the English words. They've tried to get rid of it, but as I said, language is incredibly democratic, and it is the will of the people. And so on that happy note, I'm going to see if I can get there. Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
יש לי דיליי, אני בג'טלג, היה לי אוברווייט, קניתי הנבג, כתבתי מיילים, הוספתי JPEG, אני לא בפוקוס, תוסיף לי השטג, סוואג. אומייגאד, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. לא, אני בסטרס, כל הקטע של העברית מתפספס. סיריוסלי, יש לי תחושה שזה קורס, קייסס, זה לא ביג דיל, זה מבאס. תראו, כולם היום עובדים 24/7, בלי הרבה תשוקה, עם המון פשן, נונסטופ חולמים על רילוקיישן, על אקזיט מפואר, על סטארט-אפ ניישן. יוצאים לדייטים, לאיזה רנדבו, בלופ אחד, מדז'בו לדז'בו, שותים שוטים, צ'ייסרים, דרינקים עם כולם, בונים על אפי אאואר, על הנגובר חינם, בין בלנס, בין ההיי ללו, חיים ריאליטי שואו, תאמינו לי, I know וזה להביא, hello, פגיע הזמן, that we speak the language of the Hebrew man. Oh my God, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. המקיף יהיה ב-AIG, הקבצים הם בגיף או ב-BMP, הבדיקות US, MRI, CT וה-MVP תמיד ב-VIP. לא טסים אקונומי, טסים בלואו-קוסט, לא כותבים למגירה, עכשיו כותבים לנוטס, לא ניגשים אל המבחן, ניגשים לטסט, בפייט אגרסיבי נותנים את הבסט, ואם מתים על איזה שיט, שמים בריפיט, אם זה לא מספיק קליט, קוויק קונטרול על דילית סוויט, מעלים לסטורי, פספסת I'm sorry, no comment and glory, oh be happy, don't worry, יש לי פלשבק, היה לי בלקאוט, עשיתי צ'ק אין, עשיתי צ'ק אאוט, הייתי פייבוריט, קיבלתי נוקאוט, לקחתי מיקרופון, עשיתי סולד אאוט. אומייגאד, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. אומייגאד, קשה שפה, העברית החדשה, גם בן יהודה לא ידע, פליז יותר עברית בבקשה. איך אומרים וי-פיי בעברית? איך אומרים פרוטקשן בעברית? איך אומרים סלפי בעברית? איך אומרים אקשן בעברית? איך אומרים מידיום בעברית? איך אומרים פרימיום בעברית? איך אומרים וואלה חסרות לנו מילים, לעברית יש בעיות אז מלווים ומלווים ומלווים. אומייגאד, שפה קשה, העברית החדשה, אני לא מבין את המבטא, דבר אל העברית בבקשה. וואי וואי וואי, שפה קשה, העברית